The snow was falling so hard, it felt like the sky was emptying itself onto the earth all at once, each flake hitting her skin like a cold warning that time was running out. And the Christmas bride stumbled through the drifting white with her baby clutched tight against her chest, her veil frozen stiff against her hair, her dress soaked and heavy from the storm she should never have been caught in. Her lips trembled uncontrollably as she whispered, "Please, not on Christmas Eve. Please not tonight," the words cracking in the frigid air as if even her voice were freezing, and the baby, his tiny face pressed helplessly to her collarbone, gave a weak, broken whimper that sounded less like a cry and more like breath slipping away. She tightened her arms around him, her fingers numb and stiff, barely able to feel his warmth through the layers of soaked fabric, and she forced herself forward toward the faint golden glow of a church window flickering through the blizzard, the last place she believed someone might show mercy on a night meant for compassion. The snow reached her knees, pulling at her dress, dragging her down, but she pushed through, teeth clenched, chest burning as she whispered again, "Please, someone," hoping, praying, pleading that the sight of a woman in a wedding dress with a dying baby in her arms would be enough to crack open a door in a town that had already turned its back on her once. She reached the church steps and nearly collapsed, bracing herself with one frozen hand as she raised the other to the door, knocking once, then again, her knuckles hitting wood too cold for pain, but nothing stirred inside, not even a flicker of movement behind the stained glass glow. "I know someone's there," she choked out, her breath turning to frost before it reached the night. "Please, he's fading. He won't last. It's Christmas." But the only reply was the hollow hush of wind pushing against the eaves. She pressed her forehead to the door, shaking, tears freezing on her cheeks, the baby growing frighteningly still, and she whispered in a voice so small it nearly disappeared, "Please, not like this. Not on Christmas Eve." She pushed herself upright, legs trembling violently, and stepped back into the storm, trying the parsonage door next, knocking with what little strength she had left. But as the curtain inside twitched and a shadow moved away, she understood. No one would open for a woman carrying a baby they believed wasn't hers, no matter the night, no matter the snow, no matter the desperation bleeding from her voice. The wind howled harder, a sharp, slicing cold that cut through her soaked dress and into her bones, and she sank to her knees again, clutching her child so tightly he whimpered at the pressure, not even strong enough to truly cry anymore. "Please, not on Christmas Eve, please." She begged the storm itself now, her body folding over the infant as the world blurred into white, and as her vision dimmed at the edges, she felt the horrifying truth press into her chest. She might not stand again, and the baby wouldn't survive another hour of this cold. She forced herself to look up one last time, searching for any sign of life, any human shape, any passing soul willing to see her, not as a burden, not as a scandal, but as a mother begging the night for mercy, and finding none. The wind howled across the open street like a living thing, pushing her sideways as she tried to rise, snow swirling around her in choking, stinging waves that blurred the edges of every building, every lantern, every hope. She held the baby closer, pressing his tiny body to the hollow of her chest as if her own heartbeat might pull warmth back into him. But his breaths were so faint now, she couldn't feel them unless she held completely still. And stillness meant freezing. Stillness meant dying. So she forced herself up with a sob that cracked the frozen air. Her legs didn't fully obey her anymore, bending at the wrong angles before locking painfully straight. But she staggered forward anyway, one hand shielding the baby's face from the wind while the other dragged along the wall of the general store for balance. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice raw. "Please, baby, stay with me." But the infant barely whimpered, his lips pale, his cries only tiny puffs of frost against her collarbone. Panic sliced into her chest, cold, sharp, merciless, because she knew the signs, knew how quickly cold could pull life out of something so small, and she pressed a trembling kiss to his forehead, feeling nothing but ice beneath her lips. She stumbled toward a small cottage at the edge of the square, its windows glowing faintly yellow behind sheets of blowing snow, and she knocked again, softer this time, nearly pleading through the door itself. "Please, I'm begging you, my baby is freezing." A shadow passed inside, but the latch didn't turn, and she heard the muted voice of a woman whisper, "Don't open it. She'll bring trouble with her." Before the light dimmed and footsteps retreated deeper into the house, the bride sagged forward, forehead hitting the cold wood, tears sliding down her cheeks only to freeze in tiny glass-like beads against her skin, and she slid down the door until she was sitting in the snow again, her soaked wedding dress spreading around her like a collapsed angel's wings. The baby's breathing hitched, then slowed again, and terror surged through her so fiercely she forced herself upright, gripping him with shaking arms as she stumbled away from the houses that refused her. "It's Christmas Eve," she murmured, her words unraveling in the storm. "Someone, anyone." But the night swallowed her voice and gave nothing back. Her path dragged toward the outskirts now, toward the darker edges where lantern light no longer reached, and she almost didn't notice her feet sinking deeper into untouched drifts. Almost didn't realize she was wandering away from the town entirely, too dazed to think, too desperate to turn back. A gust slammed into her so hard she nearly fell, and she wrapped her entire body over the baby, curling around him, shielding him from the wind with her own thin frame. "Don't go," she begged him, her tears falling onto his cold cheek. "Not tonight, not on Christmas Eve, please." She rocked him gently, rhythm broken by the violent shivers racking her body, and for a moment she thought she felt him stir, but it was only her own trembling. Her fingers stiffened until she couldn't bend them, her lips splitting from the cold, and as the world blurred into white shapes swirling endlessly, she realized with a crushing, breath-stealing dread that she was losing the strength to hold him at all. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her cheek to his, whispering the only prayer she had left. "If someone finds us, let him live, even if I don't." And the storm answered with another blast of snow that buried her footprints behind her, as if the night itself were trying to erase her from the world. She stumbled through the deepening drifts like a ghost the storm hadn't decided to claim yet, her vision tunneling to a narrow blur of white and shadow as she searched for any sign, any lantern, any porch light, any human voice willing to see her as more than trouble. But the storm had swallowed the town whole, leaving only the sound of windows slamming shut when she got too close. She reached the boarding house next, its porch creaking under the weight of fresh snow, and she clung to the rail as she knocked, then knocked again, her voice barely carrying over the wind as she whispered, "Please, he's just a baby. Please." Inside, the warm glow flickered, footsteps approached, and then stopped. She heard a man mutter, "Not again. She's the bride who ran from the church." And a woman's strained voice snapped back, "We open that door and we'll be feeding her all winter. Don't you dare." Before the footsteps retreated and the lamp inside was dimmed until only a thin line of yellow showed beneath the door. She leaned her forehead against the wood, feeling the heat just inches away, so close she could almost imagine letting her fingers thaw against it. But it might as well have been a wall of ice. The baby whimpered faintly, a sound so weak it sliced her chest open, and she pulled him closer, rubbing his tiny back with hands so numb she couldn't tell if she was touching him at all. "I'm trying," she whispered, choking on the words. "I'm trying, sweetheart. Please stay with me." But the baby's head lolled against her collarbone, his breath shallow, uneven. Terror clawed up her spine, raw and breathless, and she forced herself away from the house, stumbling back into the blizzard, the wind dragging at her dress like hands trying to pull her under. She headed for the blacksmith shop next, a place that always smelled of warmth and coal and iron, and she pounded on the door with what little strength remained, whispering, "Please, please, he's freezing." But a gruff voice answered from inside, "Not my problem," she should have thought before running out on her wedding. And the hammering of metal resumed, drowning out her pleas until she could no longer tell whether she was shaking from cold or the heartbreak of realizing the whole town had already decided she didn't deserve kindness. She staggered backwards, almost slipping as she held the baby in a desperate cradle, and she turned toward the livery stable at the edge of the square, a single lantern flickering inside, shadows moving between the stalls. Hope flickered, faint as the light inside, and she pushed herself forward, boots sinking deep into the snow, her breath ragged as she reached the stable door. She knocked weakly, her shoulder pressing against the rough boards as she murmured, "He's dying. Please, not on Christmas Eve." And for a moment she thought the door might open. The lantern inside wavered. A figure paused just a few feet away, hand hovering near the latch. But then a second voice hissed, "Leave her. Don't get dragged into her mess." And the figure turned away, footsteps fading, until nothing remained but the rustle of straw and the thundering of her own pulse in her ears. She sagged to her knees again, snow swallowing her skirt, the cold biting deeper now, past skin, past bone, past thought. And she curled herself around the baby, rocking him gently as the storm screamed around them, her eyes stinging with frozen tears as she whispered to a night that refused to listen, "Please, someone, just see us." Not knowing that someone was watching, not from a window or a warm room, but from the far edge of the square, a dark silhouette barely visible through the storm, pausing mid-stride as if something had pulled him toward the sight of a bride in the snow, clutching a fading child on Christmas Eve. The wind rose with a sudden, violent force, as if the storm had finally noticed her, and decided to finish what the town had started, shoving her sideways until she nearly toppled into the drift pressed against the livery wall. She braced herself with one hand, the other locked around the baby, whose tiny body had grown terrifyingly limp. His skin cold enough to burn her numb fingertips. Her breath came in shallow, panicked bursts as she tried to shield his face with the last dry piece of her torn veil, whispering, "Stay with me. Stay with me, please." Even though her own voice was fading under the roar of the snow, she forced herself up once more, legs trembling violently beneath her, and pushed away from the stable, stumbling blindly toward the dark ridge that skirted the edge of town. She didn't know where she was going anymore, only that she had to keep moving or the cold would claim them both. The storm blurred everything into white, swallowing streets, buildings, even her own footprints seconds after she made them, and she clutched the baby tighter, trying to share what little warmth remained in her body. Her mind flickered to the moment she'd run from the church earlier that afternoon, dressed in white, carrying hope she'd believed would last a lifetime, only to discover her groom had lied, had debts, had promised her to men who saw her not as a wife, but as payment. She'd escaped before the vows could bind her, clutching the infant she'd found abandoned behind the chapel, wrapped in a thin blanket and crying for a mother who never returned. Now that desperate choice felt like both salvation and doom. The memory blurred in the storm, replaced by the sickening drop of her knees giving out again as they reached the edge of the square, her body folding around the baby as she fell into the snow with a choked cry. She pressed her cheek to his forehead and felt nothing, no warmth, no movement, and panic tore through her, primal and wild as she rubbed his little arms, his cold fingers, trying to spark life back into him. "Please, please don't go," she begged, her tears freezing instantly on her lashes, turning her vision into a fractured shimmer of lights and shadow. She forced herself upright again, but her legs shook so violently they barely held her, and she staggered forward only a few steps before collapsing once more, her breath hitching in sharp, painful gasps that sounded like someone drowning in air. The storm pressed closer, snow piling against her sides, creeping beneath her dress, numbing her skin until she could barely feel the baby at all. The world narrowed to a tunnel of white, to the tiny weight in her arms, to the pounding terror in her chest. He's slipping, he's slipping, he's slipping. And she curled her body tighter around him, whispering, I promised I'd keep you safe." But the wind tore the words away before she could even hear them herself. She didn't see the figure move through the storm, didn't notice the tall shadow cutting through the blizzard with long, purposeful strides, didn't realize someone had been watching her struggle from the moment she left the stable, only that the snow around her shifted, a darker shape drawing closer, moving with the quiet certainty of a man who had already decided that the storm would not take her, not tonight, not on Christmas Eve, not while he still breathed. She didn't hear him at first. Her world had narrowed too sharply, too painfully, to the baby's fading breaths and the crushing weight of snow piling against her ribs. But the warrior had been watching her for several long, tense minutes from the edge of the blizzard, his silhouette barely more than a dark streak against the white, drawn toward her by instincts honed through winters far crueler than this one. He saw the way she crumpled again, her knees buckling as she curled over the child, her wedding dress melting into the snow, until she looked like she was becoming part of the storm itself. And something deep in him, something older than the night, older than the swirling sky, tightened with a fierce, immediate certainty. If he didn't reach her now, neither she nor the child would see another breath. He moved without hesitation, boots cutting deep tracks through drifts that swallowed his legs to the knee, the wind whipping against his braids as he crossed the open ground with long, sure strides. The bride barely registered the crunch of snow until he was almost beside her, a tall shadow materializing out of the blizzard with a presence so steady it felt like the storm bent around him. She blinked up through frozen lashes, dazed, her voice barely more than a cracked whisper. "Please, not on Christmas Eve. Please don't let him die." And her arms tightened weakly around the baby as if she thought he might be coming to take the child away. The warrior knelt instantly, not touching her yet, but close enough that his body blocked the wind, close enough that she felt warmth radiating from him in the freezing dark. His eyes swept over her, blue-lipped, shivering, soaked to the bone, then to the infant tucked against her chest, whose tiny face had turned a frightening shade of gray. The warrior's breath left him in a sharp, controlled exhale, the kind that only came when a man saw death pressing too close. "Give him to me," he said quietly, not demanding, not threatening, just certain. And when she shook her head in a broken, instinctive refusal, he softened his voice, leaning closer until she could hear him through the storm. "I can keep him warm. You cannot. Let me help." Something in the steadiness of his tone, something in the calm that cut through her panic like a warm hand in the dark, made her grip falter, and she nodded once, trembling. He slipped the baby from her arms with extraordinary care, pressing the child beneath his heavy fur cloak and against his bare chest, trapping every bit of warmth he had left between their bodies. The baby gave a tiny, almost non-existent shiver, and the warrior closed the cloak tighter around him, murmuring something soft and Apache, words meant to call life back toward the little one, slipping so dangerously far from it. Then, without warning, he slid one arm under the bride's knees and the other behind her back, lifting her from the snow as if she weighed nothing at all. She gasped softly, startled by the strength and heat of him, her cold, stiffened fingers curling instinctively into the leather across his shoulder. The warrior stood, turning into the wind, shielding both mother and child with his body as he began walking, slow, controlled steps cutting a clear path through the blizzard. She blinked against his chest, barely conscious, her voice trembling out of her in a thin whisper. Who are you?" He didn't look down, didn't slow, just tightened his hold around her as he said with quiet certainty, "Someone who will not let the snow take you." The storm fought him with every step, hurling sheets of snow across his face, whipping his braids behind him like frayed whips, but the warrior moved as if the blizzard were nothing more than a stubborn animal, something he understood, something he'd pushed through 100 times before. He kept the Christmas bride pulled tight against his chest, her frozen fingers knotted weakly in the leather of his coat, while her head rested against his shoulder, her breath shallow and uneven as she drifted dangerously in and out of consciousness. Beneath his cloak, the baby lay pressed to his bare chest where the warrior's body heat wrapped around the tiny bundle like a second heartbeat, and with every step he checked for the faint rise and fall of the infant's breath, muttering soft Apache words meant to summon warmth, meant to summon life. "Stay awake," he murmured to the bride as her head sagged against him again. "You sleep now, and I will have to carry all 3 of our breaths alone." But she only tightened her fingers slightly, barely, around the edge of his coat, offering the smallest sign she still heard him through the roaring storm. He shifted his grip to secure her better, one arm braced beneath her knees, the other across her back, shielding her from the full force of the wind as he trudged through drifts that reached his thighs. The snow grew so thick at times he could barely see the next few feet in front of him, yet he never faltered, never paused. He counted his steps, counted the way the wind shifted, listening for the faint whistle that signaled the path toward the river valley where his people had built their winter camp. The bride stirred once, her cracked lips moving as if she wanted to speak, and he bent his head slightly, catching the faintest whisper. "The baby, is he?" "He breathes," the warrior answered softly, pressing the child closer to his chest. "Your courage kept him alive long enough for me to reach you." And though she didn't respond, he felt the tension in her shoulders ease just slightly, as if her heart clung to his words more than her body clung to his warmth. The storm clawed at them, ripping at his coat, trying to wrench the baby from beneath his cloak and drag the bride from his arms. But the warrior tightened his hold, his muscles burning with the effort to keep them lifted, protected, moving. Snow stung his face, ice clung to his eyelashes, and the biting wind seared his lungs, but he didn't slow. Every step was a refusal, every breath a vow, every heartbeat a promise that the storm would take nothing from her again. "Not much farther," he murmured, though he knew she could barely hear. "You will have fire and blankets, and he will have warmth." And for the first time since the blizzard began, hope flickered faintly in the air between them, fragile but real. The bride's head lolled against his neck, her tears, warm at first, then freezing fast, sliding across his skin as she whispered almost soundlessly, Why would you help me?" The warrior didn't answer immediately. He shifted the baby closer, tightened his hold around her again, and then said with quiet, steady truth, "Because no one else did." The words cutting through the wind like a blade of warmth, like the first spark of a fire trying to catch in the dark. And as he pushed forward, the storm howling around them, he spotted the faint, wavering glow of torchlight through the snow, the first sign that they were close enough for hope to mean something. The first flicker of torchlight cut through the blizzard like a fragile thread of salvation, and the warrior angled his body toward it, shielding the woman and the fading baby as he descended the snow-covered ridge toward the hidden river valley where his people had taken shelter for the winter. The wind eased only slightly in the hollow, enough that he could hear the faint sound of drums, steady, low, rhythmic, guiding him toward the cluster of winter lodges nestled between bent cottonwoods and ice-laden rocks. As he neared the outskirts of the encampment, 2 sentries emerged from behind a row of pine trunks, boughs raised in instinctive caution. But the moment they recognized him, they lowered their weapons, their eyes widening at the sight of the bride limp in his arms and the baby tucked beneath his cloak. One of the sentries, a young man with frost in his braids, stepped forward urgently and said, "Kahea, you are bleeding." But the warrior shook his head sharply, his breath steaming in the cold. "It is not my blood you must worry about. Prepare the lodge," he commanded, his voice tight with exhaustion, but carrying enough authority to send both sentries sprinting down the path. He followed at a controlled pace, not rushing, never risking a stumble with the fragile lives he carried, his boots sinking into snow that had been trampled smooth by dozens of feet. As he approached the central lodge, elders stepped out, their shawls drawn tight against the wind, their faces tightening with alarm as they took in the sight before them. A silver-haired woman named Alawa, known for her healing hands, reached them first, pressing her palm to the bride's cheek and flinching at the bitter cold of her skin. "She has no warmth left," Alawa murmured, her voice raw with urgency. "Kahea, bring her inside, quickly." He pushed aside the heavy hide door and ducked into the lodge, where the heat from a roaring fire washed over them instantly, filling the air with the smell of cedar and warm cloth. A low murmur rose from those inside as they saw the baby's limp form, the too still chest, the frightening pallor beneath the cloak, and Alawa's breath caught, her eyes sharp with fear as she said, "Lay them near the flames, now." He knelt carefully, placing the baby on a thick fur pelt and lowering the bride beside him, her head rolling weakly until Alawa guided it onto a folded blanket. "What happened?" another elder asked, pressing warm hands to the bride's wrist, searching for a pulse. "Frozen," the warrior answered, stripping the cloak from his shoulders and wrapping it around the baby, his jaw clenched in frustration at the cruelty that had left them outside on such a night. "The town closed their doors," he added, forcing the words out slowly. "Every one of them." A ripple of anger moved through the lodge, voices whispering in disbelief, in sorrow, in outrage that on Christmas Eve a mother and child had been turned away into a death storm, Alawa leaned over the baby, lifting him gently, her hands sure but trembling with urgency as she pressed him against her warm chest and said, "Bring the stones. We must heat them now." Two young women rushed to the fire, using tongs to lift smooth river stones glowing red from the flames, wrapping them quickly in thick cloth before placing them around the infant's tiny body to draw the cold from him slowly enough not to stop his heart. The bride's lips parted, a faint sound escaping. Something between a breath and a cry, and the warrior moved instantly to her side, lifting her hand between his palms, rubbing life back into her fingers with slow, steady motions. Her eyelashes fluttered, barely, her voice cracking as she whispered, Is he still?" The warrior bent close, letting his warmth surround her hand as he murmured, "He breathes. Hold to that." The words deep and certain as the fire that roared behind them. But Alawa's brow furrowed deeper, her eyes fixed on the baby's unmoving chest, and the camp, once filled with frantic motion and urgent orders, fell into a tense, breathless silence as everyone waited for a sound, a cry, a gasp, any sign that the storm had not claimed him after all. The silence in the lodge grew so heavy it felt like the fire itself had stopped crackling. Every pair of eyes fixed on the tiny bundle wrapped in furs and warmed stones, waiting, praying, for any sign that the child still lingered on the thin edge between this world and the next. The bride lay beside him, still trembling violently despite the heat, her lashes clumped with melted frost, her lips cracked and pale as she whispered, barely audible, "Please, please breathe." The words breaking apart like thin ice beneath her voice. The warrior knelt between the two of them, one hand wrapped around the bride's cold fingers, the other hovering protectively near the baby as if he could shield both with sheer will. His jaw set in the hard, unyielding line of a man refusing to accept loss. Alawa worked with swift, practiced movements, lifting the warmed stones closer, adjusting the furs, rubbing the child's tiny arms with careful strokes meant to coax the life back into them. But her eyes flicked up every few seconds with a silent fear she couldn't hide, that they had found the pair too late, that even the miracle of fire might not reach a body chilled this far. The baby's chest rose, only in the slightest flutter, so faint it was hard to tell if it was breath or the trembling of the fur beneath him, and the bride let out a broken sound, her hand clutching the warrior's harder, as if clinging to the world through him alone. "He's slipping," she choked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't lose him, not tonight, not after everything." And the warrior leaned forward, his voice low but fierce as he whispered, "He is still here. Do not let fear take you from him now." The firmness of his tone a lifeline thrown into her drowning panic. Alawa moved closer, laying two fingers lightly on the baby's sternum, her brows knitting as she felt for the faint life beneath her hand. And then she motioned sharply to a young woman near the fire, saying, "More stones, hotter." Her voice trembling with urgency, the young woman hurried, lifting glowing stones from the heart of the flames, wrapping them in thick hides and placing them carefully around the baby's body until a small pocket of warmth enclosed him like a fragile cocoon. Minutes passed, long, painful, breath-stealing minutes, and the bride's trembling worsened, her eyes turning glassy as exhaustion pulled her under. But the warrior caught her chin gently, forcing her to meet his gaze, murmuring, "Stay with him. He will feel your voice even if he cannot hear it." And she nodded weakly, pressing her forehead to the furs beside the child as she whispered, "Please breathe, please breathe, please breathe," like a prayer woven into the rhythm of her fading strength. Then, so suddenly it stole the air from the room, the baby's chest rose in a fuller, deeper breath, followed by a tiny gasp that sounded like the first unfrozen sound he had made in hours. The bride froze, eyes flying open, tears spilling anew as the baby let out a thin, wavering cry, weak but alive, and the entire lodge exhaled at once, the sound a soft chorus of relief and gratitude that rippled through the warm, firelit space. The bride's hands shook so badly she could barely touch him, but she reached anyway, brushing his cheek with trembling fingers as she sobbed, "Thank you, thank you." Not knowing if she spoke to the child, to the elders, or to the warrior who had refused to let the snow claim them. The warrior closed his eyes briefly, the tight knot in his chest loosening as that fragile, precious cry echoed against the lodge walls. Proof, not of luck, but of will, that life had chosen to return on a night when everything else had turned them away. The fire burned steady through the long winter night, its glow painting the lodge walls in soft amber as the storm outside slowly lost its voice, and by the time dawn finally bled through the sky in faint strokes of gray-blue, the blizzard had quieted to nothing more than a hush drifting off the river. The Christmas bride lay curled on the furs, no longer shaking violently but breathing in slow, fragile pulls of warm air, her fingers still resting near the baby's blanket as if she feared losing him the moment she let go. The infant, now wrapped in layers of soft skins and warm stones, slept with a peaceful rise and fall of his tiny chest, still weak, still small, but unmistakably alive, and each breath felt like a gift the night had nearly stolen. The warrior sat beside them both, his posture straight despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in his body, eyes half-lidded but never drifting away from the fragile pair he'd carried through the storm. Outside, the camp stirred slowly awake, footsteps crunching over snow, soft voices murmuring in the cold air as children peeked from lodges, surprised to see the sky calm after a night that had tried so fiercely to swallow the world. Alawa entered again, her shawl wrapped snug around her shoulders, and knelt beside the baby to check his warmth, her expression easing into a rare smile as she whispered, "He is stronger this morning. The storm did not win." And the bride's breath hitched as she blinked awake, disoriented for a heartbeat before her eyes flew toward her child. She pushed herself upright too quickly, swaying with dizziness until the warrior steadied her with a gentle touch to her shoulder, murmuring, "Slow, your strength has not yet returned." And she nodded, though her eyes never left the baby, her trembling hands reaching toward him as she whispered, "Is he really?" Alawa nodded with soft certainty, placing the baby carefully into the bride's waiting arms, and the woman let out a broken breath, hugging him close, her tears falling silently onto his tiny forehead. She held him for a long, quiet moment, rocking him gently as the warrior watched, his gaze steady, protective, unreadable, but undeniably softened, as she whispered, "Thank you. Thank you," though she didn't know whether she was speaking to the old healer, the fire, or the man who had refused to let the world turn cold around her. When she finally lifted her face toward the warrior, her voice was hoarse and small as she asked, "Why did you find us? Why did you stop?" He met her gaze, something deep and unspoken flickering behind his dark eyes, as the faint light of morning warmed the edges of the lodge, his answer low and quiet but certain, "Because no one should be alone on a night meant for mercy." And then after a small pause, even softer, "Not you. Not him." Outside, the first full light of Christmas morning spilled over the snowy ridge, catching the smoke that rose in soft spirals above the winter lodges, and for the first time since the storm began, warmth, not from fire, but from something steadier, something human, finally reached the place in her chest she thought the cold had taken forever. By midday, the storm had surrendered completely, leaving the valley washed in a soft, clean brightness that made the snow glitter like crushed glass beneath the pale winter sun. And the Christmas bride stepped out of the lodge for the first time since the night that nearly claimed her, the baby bundled against her chest in warm furs that still carried the scent of the campfire. She paused beneath the low arch of the doorway, breathing in the sharp, cold air that no longer felt like an enemy but something reborn, gentler, a reminder that she had lived through the kind of night people told stories about generations later. Children ran past her carrying woven baskets to gather fallen pine branches, their laughter rising like small bells. And across the clearing she saw women sewing new blankets, men repairing sled runners, elders walking the perimeter with slow, steady steps. Signs of a community that had endured countless winters because they chose, again and again, to endure them together. The warrior stood near the river's edge, scraping frost from a long wooden staff before plunging it into the water to gauge the thickness of the ice, his breath drifting in steady clouds, his figure strong and calm against the bright snow. The bride walked toward him slowly, her legs still unsteady, but her resolve firmer with each step. And when he looked up at her approaching shadow, his eyes softened in that quiet way he carried everything, with steadiness, with truth, without demand. She stopped a few feet from him, adjusting the baby in her arms as she whispered, "He's warm. He slept because of you." And the warrior shook his head gently, tapping the staff once against the ice before turning fully toward her. "He lived because you never stopped fighting. For him," he said, his voice deep but soft, "and because winter, even at its worst, cannot break a heart that refuses to surrender." And for a moment she didn't know whether the warmth rising in her chest came from his words or the soft weight of the child breathing against her. She swallowed, her voice catching as she whispered, "They turned us away. Every door, every window. I thought no one would see us." And the warrior stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that his presence wrapped around her like a shield, like a promise. "I saw you," he murmured, "because you were meant to be found." And the truth in his tone, steady, unwavering, struck something deep inside her, a place still tender from fear, but beginning, slowly, to pulse with something steadier than survival. The baby shifted in her arms, a soft sound slipping from him like the echo of last night's miracle. And she looked down at his tiny face, the warmth of life blooming in his cheeks again, before lifting her gaze back to the man who had carried them through a world that had closed its doors. For the first time since the blizzard began, she felt the faintest spark of belonging, fragile, yes, but real, and as the wind rustled through the iced pines behind them, she whispered, "I don't know where to go now. We have no home." Her voice trembling not with fear this time, but with the raw ache of honesty. The warrior's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes steadied even further as he answered, "Then stay here. No woman who survived a storm like that walks alone in our camp." And as she let those words settle into the deepest parts of her, she felt the strange, unexpected truth, that the storm which nearly ended them had instead led them to the first place where the cold couldn't reach. She glanced down at the baby, then toward the warm circle of lodges behind them, and when she looked back at the warrior, her breath left her in a small, fragile whisper. "Thank you for seeing us." Before the wind carried her words into the bright, breaking sky, her heart finally steady as warmth pooled in the space winter had tried to claim. Which moment touched you the deepest tonight? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Redemption West stories.